Welcome to the What If It's Not Depression podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein, and I am interviewing Dr. Vaish Sarathy. Dr. Vaish Sarathy is a functional nutrition practitioner and science and math teacher in multiple settings. She comes to functional nutrition and education with a mission to reframe health, cognition, and optimal function for children with disabilities. Vaish believes that sound nutrition and an equal education are the birthright of every child. Her perspective is shaped by her own autistic, non-speaking 14-year-old son with Down syndrome, who is a published poet and author. Her 2019 TEDx talk, "Who Decides How Smart You Are?" about the value of assuming intelligence in all kids, has been hailed as mind-blowing, powerful, and eye-opening by parents and practitioners alike. Vaish also hosts a podcast called Functional Nutrition and Learning for Kids, where she interviews thought leaders from education, learning, functional medicine, as well as disabled people with different communications. Welcome, Dr. Vaish Sarathy.
Thank you, Achina. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, so if you like this episode, please click the like button and subscribe and share this episode with other people who might be interested. I would love for as many people to know about this wonderful, incredible person. And let's dive in real quick and start with your own journey with your son or your son's journey.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my son is now 14. He'll be 15 in a few days, actually. So let's and he's autistic. He has Down syndrome. He's non-speaking. So he has multiple disabilities. And and I say this very casually now, so because it's really not a big deal to me anymore. But when he was born, and this is generally the case when you talk to other parents that have kids with, let's say, Down syndrome, because you know at birth that the child has Down syndrome, that there's very dire prognosis. You know, doctors will come and tell you with a very serious face that they're sorry, there's a lot of crying going on, there's a lot of despair. You know, it's almost like you've entered this world of grief and sorrow, and like you've as though something terrible has happened. And that was really where I was when Sid was born, for a good part of a year. And when eventually you accept the diagnosis, but and that we didn't have a plan or anything in mind as such. And for a while, I was also in denial because I was pretty sure that all of this doesn't mean anything, because I have a really huge belief that I am very smart. So I was like, there is no way that my son cannot be smart, right?
Right.
I sometimes arrogance helps a little bit, but as he got, when he turned 3 and when we saw other kids with Down syndrome, it was hugely apparent that even when compared to other kids with Down syndrome, that Sid was lagging behind, not just in communication, but it seemed to me in understanding as well. So there's two parts to this story. There's one is the understanding of his cognitive level, and the other is his, what we call, dysregulation.
Right.
But I'll focus on the latter part first.
Okay.
As he turned 4, he also accumulated a diagnosis of autism at the time. And this was a time when he was starting to, have fits of laughter. He would sit in the corner of a room, rocking back and forth, and he would just be laughing for almost hours on end. And I had no idea what was going on. And I was new to, I wasn't new, I had no idea what functional nutrition or even just regular nutrition. I didn't know anything. And at the time he was eating what I'll call a standard Indian diet, which was mainly, homemade chapatis, which is just like, whole wheat tortillas, and a lot of whole milk, and basically wheat and dairy over and over again. He wouldn't eat anything else. But we thought it was homemade, so all was great, right? So we were very happy with the diet we're giving him. We were with this child that couldn't go to school, couldn't sit for even 5 minutes in school, couldn't pay attention, couldn't, he would dissolve into peals of laughter. It was scary because we could tell that he didn't want to be. Doctors would say that, oh, your child is laughing and not crying, that must be a good thing. No, it's not a good thing. This is an uncontrollable, almost drunk laughter.
Right.
And now, of course, we know that it could have been an yeast overgrowth. it took a naturopath told us that it was probably systemic yeast overgrowth, and some medication at the time, a drug did help. But over time, these symptoms kept coming back. So it was kind of a desperate time in India when we were there. We didn't have access to our doctors. He was completely a mess, laughing throughout the day, unable to even hold himself up because he was so dysregulated that he would fall down into peals of laughter. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. And I had no idea what to do. So I just sat in front of a computer and did research. And when we came back to the US, I decided that at the point enough was enough. And one fine day, we moved to the GAPS diet. This was from a standard Indian diet to a GAPS diet.
GAPS
and
diet.
that began, yeah.
Just why don't you tell the audience what the GAPS diet is?
And the GAPS diet is a grain-free diet. It's basically a version of a specific carbohydrate diet where we limit complex carbohydrates. In other words, anything complex carbohydrates are basically, they're called disaccharides or polysaccharides. They're multiple sugars connected to each other. The only carbs that you can eat on a GAPS diet are simple sugars like fruits and honey. Mm-hmm. And then so basically the diet mostly consists of nuts, seeds, meat, sugar, not sugar, sorry, right. What am I saying? Fruits, vegetables, and non-starchy vegetables, and so on.
Right.
But just so
people know that GAPS stands for Gut and Psychology Syndrome diet. It's a natural treatment for autism, dyspraxia, ADD, dyslexia, ADHD, depression, schizophrenia. And it's all written about in a book by Natasha Campbell McBride. She's the author of that book and that diet, just so people know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I don't anymore believe that it's a treatment so much for at least autism, because I don't believe that it needs to be treated like that. But it's definitely a treatment for an inflamed gut at any rate. So, and that it did. That began our journey into the world of exploring how food is medicine. We did not end up staying on the GAPS diet for too long. And that's another story of how sometimes diets can be too restrictive, and that's not necessarily a good thing either. Right. But 6 months on the GAPS diet followed by a standard anti-inflammatory diet, which I'll talk about more later. But that really helped my son to come back to his center. So in the sense that he could at least sit without kind of completely dissolving into really a laughing mess. So it would just help him just keep his body comfortable. And it was very clear to me. At the time, I thought that he was missing out on so much by not eating wheat and dairy. Every time we would try to bring forbidden food back, and then putting forbidden in quotes here, but it would be disastrous for us. So while I have I
really want to highlight just how much food is poison and food is medicine, because people don't realize how much food can really affect your brain as well as your body. So yeah, it's a perfect example. Yeah, great.
Yeah, and I think there's no matter how many, you can have supplements or you can have medication, and often, we think supplements are great, and they can be, but no matter how many times you eat a supplement, you're always eating more than food is the single most frequent intervention your body is getting. There is no getting away from that. There is no supplement that can, there's a common saying, right? You can't out supplement a crappy diet and so on, but it is just impossible because of the frequency with which food is hitting your body.
Exactly. Yeah. So that diet is always the first intervention. You can make so much can change so very quickly, if you make dietary changes. And I think it's worth doing an elimination diet or GAPS diet. Pick something. Start with something. But an anti-inflammatory diet ultimately ends up being the diet that most people end up being on. Yeah. Yes,
pick something and keep experimenting for a while. I do certainly believe that a diet is not the end goal. A diet is simply a means to get your child learning. This is a lesson I had to learn the hard way, because I thought a diet was going to fix my son until I realized my son didn't need fixing. All he needed was to get into a comfortable state there where there was minimal inflammation. So now you could get to learning.
Right. And that's just one layer. It's just one layer of inflammation, and there's finding other layers and and addressing those. So tell us more about what other things that you found to be impacting your son and some of your clients.
I'm going to narrow it to the areas that I focus on. So obviously, like that there are multiple levels that can affect a child. So there is dietary inflammation. There's also pathogenic overgrowth. There's the growth of bacteria and yeast, fungus, and basically just what we call dysbiosis, which means that there is just an imbalance of good and bad bacteria. And this is very common.
Right.
And unfortunately, in the world of autism, we call it functional medicine in autism was traditionally called biomed, but a lot of biomed has traditionally focused on medication to address dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is understood, which is great because they really understand it really well. But a lot of times you're pointing and shooting at the different bugs.
Right.
I think the awareness is slowly seeping in that is not enough, that it needs to be combined with a diet that that actively encourages microbial diversity in the gut and gut healing. And there's so much of this that you don't have to point and shoot with supplements. You kind of need to, you can do that initially a little bit, but you also need to sustain with food.
Exactly.
So there is, I see so many kids with really rampant inflammation, infection and inflammation, and there's this misconception that drugs are the only way to go. But coming back to your question, there's inflammation, there's infection, and the third part that is misunderstood, and I think is a gap in the way that functional medicine is practiced in kids today, is what is considered the cognitive gap, because a lot of medicine in autistic kids and kids with Down syndrome is aimed at increasing cognition. But the problem is that I'm also a science teacher, like you said, and 50% of the kids that I work with are non-speaking autistic. I have yet to meet a child that actually has a cognitive gap. What I meet are kids that have extreme dysregulation. So if you have a raging fever, or if you're sitting on a bed of needles and I teach you calculus, there's no way you're going to understand calculus. That doesn't mean you have a cognitive gap. That means something's going on biochemically in your body that I need to help first. And I need to help the inflammation, but that has nothing to do with fixing it. I'm not fixing your brain. I'm making way for learning to happen. And that's a very different language, because often we're constantly trying to bridge a non-existent cognitive gap. Right. And when we're trying to bridge that, the means can often be disrespectful to the child, because the child is not involved. So one of the first things that I work with when I work with clients is to make sure a means of communication is in place. So there are a few ways. Many of my non-speaking kids, every one of my non-speaking kids need, I really encourage that, find a means of communication. Usually a low-tech device often works. Like for my son is fluent, like you said, he's a published poet, as are many other non-speaking autistics. And when you can actually start building a bridge of communication, you can actually know what the child is really struggling with, as opposed to your idea of what the child is struggling with.
Right.
So I think that, and that's why I gave a talk about assuming intelligence, because until that happens, you're always trying to fix a child. And as long as you're trying to fix a child, there is a huge respect gap. There's a huge gap in where you are and where the child is. And you can go crazy on diet. You can and I've seen people get stuck in the gaps of a very restrictive diet. So I usually follow a philosophy of something called a least restrictive diet. Yes, you want to go anti-inflammatory. Yes, you want to ditch the dairy, the gluten, the refined sugar. Once you're done with that, the principles of working with a diet should always be a least restrictive diet. Because, and that, while assuming.
I agree with you. Yeah. Sometimes people come to me that are on a restrictive diet, and I really focus on, increasing whatever they can. And usually vegetables, I mean, you talked a little bit about diversity, increasing diversity. The best way to increase diversity is by providing vegetables, right? A wide variety, rainbow variety of vegetables. Yeah. So talk some more about this cognitive gap. How is it that you find this cognitive gap? I was sort of visualizing as you were talking about it, almost that there's a fog. Like if there was a fog that was that we were driving into. You can't see things, right? And you can't, so you have to do everything slower in terms of, let's say you're driving a car, you have to slow down. You might even have to stop until the fog clears. But as you're moving through the fog, you're starting to see things, but they're not beyond that. And it's kind of hard to drive in that way. So
Absolutely.
the way you talk about it, it's like clearing the fog so that you can move forward and connect on some level. So that's sort of like the image. I'm a very visual learner, so thinker. So that's the image that came to my mind when you were talking about
that is a great image. And there are two things that affect what we perceive as cognition, right? One is exactly what you said. There's the fog. It can be gut inflammation, which almost always leads to neuroinflammation, right?
Right.
And a child with a dysregulated parasympathetic sympathetic state. So again, if you're in a fight or flight response, you cannot think about, I'm just going to bring the calculus example again. If you're in fight or flight, how am I going to teach you math and calculus? It doesn't happen. So you can put that in the brain fog. It's not technically brain fog, but these are biological responses that are preventing you from learning. There can be inflammation, which we can put in the brain fog category, gut and neuro, and there can be, which will lead to the fight or flight response. So, which is also something where you cannot learn. So that's the biochemical part. The physio, is it the right way? It's not, almost physical / physiological part is something that we know as apraxia, which is a brain-body disconnect, the inability to get your muscles to move. Yes, this is also biological, but this is when a child like my son, he can't make eye contact and tell you that, like, he can't blink his eyes and say, yes, I understand. His face doesn't move to give him emotion. So because he's smiling doesn't mean he's happy. It could be like many things are going on. He can't do sign language. He simply doesn't have the fine motor skills, and therefore he cannot write. He just doesn't have control over his muscles. What we found out eventually through trial and error was using a technique called RPM. All it does is that he uses a gross motor movement where he points to letters on a letterboard. He simply doesn't have the fine motor control. Speech is fine motor. Eye contact is fine motor. Everything we use in our body to communicate with a third person is a fine motor activity. And when a child has apraxia, which is it's more than 90% of kids with Down syndrome, and it's a huge percent. I'm pretty sure it's an equal percent of autistic kids have apraxia. When you cannot communicate, how do you show to another person that you understand or that? So it's like having a computer whose display is broken, but that doesn't mean that the computer doesn't work.
Right.
And while we should address the brain fog, a huge majority of the time we're looking at a computer whose display is broken, and we're hitting that computer with, my analogy is breaking down here, but with supplements and
right.
with things like, we're thinking that, okay, I'll build my analogy better. So we're thinking that there is a virus in the system. There may be, but it may simply be a physical breakdown of the display, and you have no idea what is going on in the central processing unit because you don't have a direct line. Nobody has a direct line to the brain. What
Right.
you're perceiving as a cognitive gap in a child is most likely, and I'm saying this not because I'm very smart, because I've heard this from autistics who have started spelling to communicate and have used this is my information from other people, and because their display isn't working, right? So yes, and there may be a virus in the system, and okay, that works very well because the virus can be a real virus or a computer virus. So that,
yeah, well, in my experience with working with patients, it's usually foods, infections, like you mentioned, toxins, and stress. And all of those affect your hormones. And so those are the 5 pillars that I usually look at. And, there is definitely pathways where toxins are not able to leave, or, have, they have methylation issues with methylation or issues with detoxification that come up. So all of these things are layers that can affect the brain and create that fog. Yeah.
Correct.
So after you clear the fog, how much is kind of left in terms of a cognitive gap, what you call a cognitive gap?
Learning isn't going to happen automatically just because you've cleared the fog. So a parent may go through a functional medicine protocol, but after that, you have to actually build the neural pathways for learning to happen. So once you know that your child is comfortable, like they're able to sit at a place, like maybe you're giving them a lesson, they're able to, there's not the sensory overwhelm. So some of the symptoms you will see when you have cleared the when you've done an anti-inflammatory diet, when you've cleared some toxins, and when you have made sure there's no pathogenic, but when you have reduced the pathogenic load and so on.
Right.
What you might see is a child that has less sensory overwhelm, that they're not so sensitive to noises or to touch, and they're able to relax into their body a little bit. They're not, their pupils aren't dilated, so they're in a rest and digest mode at this time. Now this, assuming everything else is steady, there's many, the diet factor that goes into this is huge, but once you're in, even like if you can manage like 10 minutes of a rest and digest state for your child, then you have to build a learning pathway. So the mistake that could happen is that you think your child is going to sit and do math by themselves. No, because you have to build that. You have to now start presuming competence and start giving that information that your child needs, whether your child is able to show you understanding or not. And this is very key, because apraxia cannot be fixed by nutrition. Okay, so apraxia it can only be fixed by, I don't know if it can be fixed at all, but it can only be helped by by motor learning, right?
Okay.
So that may still remain for some people. For my son, still is severely apraxic, but he's also extremely regulated. So you can look at it, he's very balanced internally. There's no disturbance. He's very emotionally regulated. He's just stable. Okay. But he's apraxic. He can move his hands. So I do have to find alternative methods for learning. So it's very important that you understand that, when I say you, I mean a parent understands that you clear the brain fog through nutrition, but at the same time, you understand that apraxia is real. Right. And then you may have to use other movement therapies to work with apraxia. And you may have to continue learning. So the 3 foundations for supporting your autistic child or your dysregulated child is food is medicine, number 1. Number 2 is movement therapy. And this can be things like reflex integration, rhythmic movement, just anything that just integrates the body together, movement therapy. And the third one is presuming competence, because you can do everything to your child, but if you do not believe your child is capable of learning, you think your child has to be fixed, there's only so far you're going to go.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You have to have hope for your child, because then also when they see that you're hopeful, they might even try harder because you believe in them. But with obviously, it's finding out what those limits are and having kindness and compassion towards them when they do reach their limits. Yeah. So what are some other things that you have found that require these types of interventions besides apraxia? Are there other things that you've noticed that really requires alternate ways of approaching it once you clear that brain fog, or that fog that's affecting their ability to learn?
I usually work with kids that have a diagnosis of autism or Down syndrome. So I almost always see apraxia in my practice. But if your child doesn't have apraxia, they might have ADHD. They may have they may have what's diagnosed as a learning disability, which I don't believe in so much, because I think there are teaching disabilities, but I'm not really sure that there are learning disabilities.
I love that. Like sometimes they're not being taught in school in a style that the child is able to learn in a method where the child is able to learn. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and we're evolving. We're evolving as a society where just the neurodiversity of kids coming in. Every kid is learning differently, and I know it's not possible for teachers to teach differently for every child, but that is something that's going to evolve. Our education system is in the early stages of evolution, and it's going to have to be rapid if we want to reach our kids. When your child does not have apraxia, let's say they're a fully motor functioning child with ADHD or a diagnosed learning disability, the place where we start at that point is, dietary intervention becomes even more important, right? So there, clearing the fog is like almost 90% dietary intervention, especially blood sugar balance. And it's so simple. It's such a low hanging fruit, right? So it's such an easy thing to do, but people are always going to the next supplement that can,
Right.
that can optimize brain function. But the supplement, the thing that can really optimize brain function is stable blood sugar levels in your
Absolutely.
child.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a root cause. It is a major
Uh-huh.
cause. And, I work to get people's digestion in order,
Mhm.
getting that going as well. So you're right. I mean, what you're talking about is that there are some functional medicine practitioners that sort of practice in a traditional medical model. Instead of using medications, they're using supplements and treating symptoms downstream, as opposed to looking upstream and looking at root causes. That's what you're describing.
And I was more talking about even regular allopathic physicians, but you're right that it's true in functional medicine as well, that we're often just hitting more upstream causes or downstream
causes
causes.
with supplements. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that
Yes,
you
correct.
can't really
Yeah.
hit it with supplements, because you can actually rectify so many things with blood sugar balance, not just brain function. There's lots of things that improve with brain, so lots of.
I feel like if you just started there, we could like fix 90% of what's going on in society right now. So you could like mood swings,
Panic attacks.
Panic attacks, focus, just learning. And every time somebody comes and says that my child isn't able to focus, I'm like, what did they have for breakfast? Or they had cold cereal and milk. Can you change that to a high protein breakfast? And it's amazing how many stories you hear about, like, that's the only thing people have changed. They're still eating pretty inflammatory down the day, but like they've changed their breakfast to, I don't know, something with eggs or a protein smoothie or something like that. And then kids that had been sleeping at 11 o'clock are, these are kids that I've worked with, like kids that used to fall asleep in the middle of the day are not doing so. Kids that used to go hyperactive are not doing so. So you can actually, amazingly, blood sugar balance can cause energy crashes. In kids, it can also cause not blood sugar balance, but imbalance can cause hyperactivity as well. So it's so many areas that just a simple intervention can hit, and all you need is fat, fiber, protein.
Right. Yeah, and so many kids actually go to school without breakfast. No breakfast, right?
So true.
Yeah. They have to get up so early in the morning that they literally roll out of bed and get on in the car or on a bus, and because they just don't have the time for breakfast. Otherwise, they have to get up even earlier because of how early school starts for some people. And some people have to travel very far to get to school. So it does become a problem, and they don't even eat breakfast. So, and then lunch is like 15 minutes. You only have 15 minutes to eat lunch and relax. So I agree with you that the environment kind of needs to change in terms of the learning environment, not just teaching disabilities. It's also the environment in which we have our children learn needs to change.
And you're right. And, you could have the healthiest school lunches in place, but if you only have 15 minutes to eat them, your kid is going to choose the biggest bang for their buck in terms of time, which may be a bag of chips. So there's a lot of variables in how well your child eats. So, so it is unfortunate that we live in a system that encourages quick and fast, right? So
right. So I think you talked about the fundamentals of supporting attention and hyperactivity, those three things, right? Did you finish talking about those? Because you talked about
there are
nutrition.
On a broad level, the fundamentals of supporting anything or ADHD or autism is diet, movement therapy, and presuming competence. But within the world of diet, I would say the most fundamental of supporting your child, and if that is something that you could change right now, is to have a blood sugar balancing breakfast. So, and there's more, that we could take this through, I teach a program that goes through many steps of how to use food as medicine. But at the bare minimum, because this is something that you don't need to read a book for, you don't need a doctor to tell you, you don't need anybody's okay to get to a blood sugar balancing breakfast. And what that means is no refined sugar for breakfast. Ideally never, but at least for breakfast. And ideally have a savory breakfast. And that's why I've been doing challenges and stuff, because I think in this country, the savory breakfast is so underexplored. And I would love for kids to wake up in the morning and not even sometimes, for a lot of kids that I work with, even oatmeal can be blood sugar imbalancing because of the
Absolutely.
amount of sugar, and oatmeal itself sometimes can be, but just some kids just don't do well with that kind of breakfast.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, you mentioned a challenge, your Dosa challenge, which is a very common food in India to eat for breakfast as well as lunch, but it's very filled with protein and other ingredients. And so Dr. Sarathy has a Dosa challenge that you can find on her Instagram. That's where I saw it, right? On Instagram.
Yes, and I have a link to its functional nutrition for kids / Dosa. So you can get there. functionalnutritionforkids.com/Dosa, but it's a free challenge. And like you said, it's a dosa is a very common South Indian breakfast / snack. But it could really be any meal. And it's generally made with a combination of rice and lentils that's infinitely customizable. You can just, if you are so sensitive to carbs, then you can just make it purely lentils. But here's another like plus point. A lot of people, at least a lot of my Indian friends, will say that they're going low carb and they can't eat a dosa. And it always surprises me because a dosa is a fermented food. And depending on the degree of the whole idea behind fermentation is carbs are fermented into other products. Okay,
right.
So the whole idea of fermentation is that the carb load is reduced. Now, how much it's reduced, I have no idea. It depends on how fermented your batter is, right? So if you can and that's why people who can't drink milk can have yogurt because of fermentation. I mean, the whole idea is that your carb, and if, for example, we're talking about, I don't remember if it's the GAPS or SCD, but I think it's in the SCD that you're allowed to have yogurt that's fermented for 24 hours. The logic being that all of the milk sugar has now been converted, has been fermented, has been used up by the bacteria and yeast. So the same is true, thankfully, for the dosa batter, is that even if you have rice in the dosa batter, which please do because it really makes the taste so much better. And if you're starting off and you want a nice tasty batter, I think I would recommend that. You're really not getting that. It's not like eating white rice. So
right.
So
I was actually going to ask that question because rice by itself, made fresh, is a high glycemic type of food, right?
Yes, and dosas are not high glycemic, they're low glycemic. However, I've been looking for data, and nobody is ever actually assessed of, the way they assess glycemic index is by looking at ingredients.
Right.
So people look at 1 cup of rice, oh my God, it's high glycemic. But no, what's happened to the rice? Look at that, look at the final product. And I don't think it's actually been through a lab. If anybody can find that data and send it to me, I'd be happy. But as a 1-person test subject, a person who's really sensitive to sugar, like, I can have energy crashes with just a little bit of, if I have a cup of white rice in the morning, I'm done. I have to take 5 naps in the day. But I've had a cup of dosa batter, which contains like 3/4 white rice. And just personally, I don't feel the effects of having a carb in the day when I have a dosa. And it makes, chemically, it makes sense because that's what fermentation is.
Right.
But yeah, but if you want more protein, you can do a full lentil dosa. And the deal with fermentation, as you know, is that it makes protein more bioavailable. So it's not the same as having a cup of lentils. When it's fermented, it is now, you can forget about the phytate and the lectins and so on. It's just much more bioavailable.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I'm going to do that challenge with my son, who's a chef at Water Street Kitchen in Woods Hole. And, I'm sure he'll definitely have a blast making those with me. So I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, go to Instagram and find her, and
yes.
she'll I love the videos that you've made, and join her challenge. So
yes, please do.
Let's talk about, you mentioned the gaps in I want you to mention the gaps in the functional medicine approach when working with kids with autism and other disabilities. I'm sure that occasionally people with autism and Down syndrome and other disabilities will meet with functional medicine doctors, but it's always done the same approach. There's got to be things that you need to do differently, and maybe they're missed. I think it would be really good to talk about what those things are that really helps you to hone in with those specific diagnoses.
So, and you're talking from a diet perspective, right?
Any gaps, whatever gaps in any.
Oh, I thought you meant the GAPS diet. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, the gaps in, yeah. Okay, so
yeah, in the approach, like what are
the gaps in the
practitioners missing when it comes to this group of people?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about two gaps, and one gaps is gaps, but let's come back. Sorry, I'll just come to that later. But here's the thing. The diet rat hole or rabbit hole or whatever the word is the first gap, is that you absolutely need this can go both ways. Sometimes, usually doesn't happen with functional medicine doctors, but sometimes there are biomed doctors that are not necessarily functional medicine trained. And if you're being told that this can be, a diet is not that important, this is definitely not true. I have never met a single case of a child, and we're not talking about curing or healing autism here. All I'm talking about is a child being comfortable enough to go to the next level, to be stabilized, regulated. I'm talking about regulation. Okay.
Right.
So if it cannot happen without a consistent 100% commitment to diet, it simply cannot happen. I've not seen it.
Right.
The dysregulation will be a recurring problem as long as you're not 100% committed. Second is that a gluten-free, dairy-free diet is not a fix-it, because that can be as junky, because it can be soup, because if you're going to pancake mixes and that kind of stuff, it can be very blood sugar imbalancing. So there's no diet that's going to work if it's not blood sugar balancing. So it's not just the gluten and the dairy. Right. Those are your diet. And the third extreme of the diet situation is that you constantly have to hunt for the next diet. And this is very common in functional medicine, is that I think it's time you tried a paleo diet. Oh, I think it's time that you tighten it up to a GAPS diet. Maybe you should try an autoimmune paleo right now, because I think that we need to tighten it. This is generally the thinking. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that I want from this diet? What is it that my son or daughter or my child is really struggling with? Because I've seen people that have been for 4 years on the GAPS diet. And remember that many of the advanced diets are very carbohydrate restricting, which means that this is going to have an impact on your microbiome diversity. Right. So you do need complex carbs. However, I always think of restrictive diets as short-term fixes for specific problems. So it's very important that if you're being prescribed a diet, you know that I am trying to address pathogenic overgrowth. Therefore, I'm cutting down complex carbs and having only simple carbs. This is the time frame for which I'm going to follow this diet. And then I'm going to move back to a generic anti-inflammatory diet that does contain complex carbs. There are a lot of the diet rabbit hole of continuously searching for the next diet that's going to heal your child is a big gap in functional medicine. Or whether it's the next supplement or the next, where is your child still inflamed? That gap is not the diet. Once you have found a diet that you found to be reasonably stabilizing, the next gap is knowledge. Your child will never be regulated unless they can communicate on a level that's appropriate and respectful to them. Imagine that if I fed you the best foods and I put you on every diet and your body is super balanced, and I talk to you like a 2-year-old, you're going to be dysregulated as hell. There is no way that you're going to be able to function in an environment, even if I fed you the most organic food every day and everything was perfect. But if I taught you 2 + 2 is 4, and you had no way of telling me that I'm done with this, I've known this 20 years ago, but I keep teaching you because I don't think you understand it well. This is the biggest gap in functional medicine, is to think that functional medicine is going to fix your child. It can help. It is the means to learning, but learning is learning. So eventually you have to presume competence, and it's only neural pathways can only be built through challenging the brain through activity, not through food. Right. Food clears the muddy waters. Food clears the area. Food clears the forest. Food makes a path available to you, but you have to walk on that path, and that is the gap that you have to see. How does your child communicate?
Right.
If you have a
Right.
non-speaking child, can you find a way of communication that works for him or her? So find that. And so if I have to put that in one sentence, is that your roots are the food. Your child, for a plant to be stable, you need the roots, and that is your anti-inflammatory foods, your supplements, your removing your toxin overload. All of that is like finding your roots. But in order to grow the manure, the fertilizer, that is knowledge, and that's learning.
Learning.
Both
Right.
of these need to be in place for a plant to grow.
Right. So you said to presume competence. You want to
Yes.
presume competence at some point and start teaching and creating a plan for learning. So is
Yes.
that different from assuming intelligence? What does it mean to
That's a great
presume
question.
intelligence?
Presumed competence is now, it's becoming a little bit of a buzzword, where basically earlier we used to think that our kids were broken, and now we understand that there are biochemical issues, but your child is still a whole human being. Assuming intelligence is my word for taking it one step further, is that don't just presume competence, because competence can be anything. What I'm saying is actively assume that your child is intelligent. Here's the thing, when you assume intelligence, you will see it. Assumption of intelligence reveals intelligence, right? So because for example, my child has every diagnosis in the book that calls for intellectual disability: Down syndrome, autism, and non-speaking. He was once diagnosed to be in the 0.1 percentile of intelligence in his peers, which means that 99.9% of his age peers are smarter than him, which is absolutely not true. But that was what we were told when he was 3 years old, because he couldn't communicate. What I did, even when he couldn't communicate, is with inspiration from others, is I started teaching him addition. And it didn't matter if he was listening to me or not. I just assumed that what's the worst that can happen? He doesn't understand, that's fine, I'm going to teach him. He used to look at me, and when I was showing him addition stuff. And then when he stopped looking at me, instead of thinking, oh, he doesn't get it, I moved to multiplication. And then when he stopped looking at me, I moved to exponents. This is what assuming intelligence is, that your child doesn't have to prove, because proving is a fine motor skill.
Right.
They do not have to prove that they can get it. You just take them, you assume that they're capable. And that is what is called in disability literature as the least dangerous assumption. The least dangerous assumption is that your child is smart, because the worst that can happen is that maybe they're not. But if we're going to go to, on our deathbed thinking that I've taught my child too much, that's not a bad thing.
Right.
But
Right.
the other worst case scenario is that your child did understand everything. And this is, as we know now, is true more than 90% of the case. And
Right.
if we're going to go to our deathbed thinking, oh, I taught my child addition for his entire life, he's actually a fully smart, functional human being, that is a huge load to bear.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. I think sometimes people think that they don't want to pressure their child. They assume that they can't do it, and they don't want to pressure their child to do something that they think they're not capable of doing. And I think challenging them and finding that out, I think in whichever way that the child and you communicate with each other is probably the better path, because then you could always, show them kindness and compassion about the result, as opposed to saying, well, it's good to try, it's good to challenge yourself. And if you can't do it, you can't do it, but let's see how far you can take it. So I think there's
definitely there's a balance between that. And by no means do I advocate pressurizing a child, because if you're there, then we're looking for output again. We're testing the child. That is not something I'm just saying, share information with
Absolutely.
joy.
Yeah.
And share age appropriate information with joy. So which is like when you're talking to a 13-year-old, talk like you're talking to a 13-year-old.
Right.
Just because they're autistic and non-speaking, or just because they have Down syndrome, doesn't make them a 5-year-old. They're still a 13-year-old. So give them, pressurizing happens when we're expecting something back.
Mm-hmm.
So, and yeah, so this is just making it. Yeah.
Yes, that's a great distinction. But I think it's important for us to talk about that, because I don't even think the parents realize it's an unconscious bias, right? That they're making. They don't even realize that they're doing it. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's really important to just put that out there as we're talking.
No, I'm glad you brought that topic up. That's really important, because so much nuance is in there. This isn't a topic that even in the few minutes that we've been speaking, clarifies itself by any means. There is so much nuance in presuming competence versus adding pressure versus, I mean, especially if you're talking to a South Asian section of society, this is very easily interpreted as kill your child with homework, right? So that's not what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And in all other cultures too, it's not just South Asian. So so we're coming to the end of our time, but I would love for you to add anything at this point that we haven't discussed that you think is so important that my audience knows when it comes to this topic.
At the risk of repeating myself, I think it's really important that you start every journey with your child with with the assumption that they're fully capable of being regulated. And this regulation is, the path to this regulation is through food. As you know, food is the single most frequent intervention we put in our body. Food is medicine. Food is everything. So when you can get started, and if you just want one place to get started, just get started with a blood sugar balancing meal. But find your way into an anti-inflammatory diet pathway for your child. And then from there, just once your child is comfortable, remember that your child is completely capable of learning whatever it is that they want to learn.
Right.
So,
right.
yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for all of that information. And it gives people so much hope, I'm sure. And I wish you luck on your journey in helping whoever reaches out to work with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're a huge resource. I've had a patient who had autism, and he was, I'm going to say he was about, I think 18 years old. And his mother had reached out to me because her last option was to put him in a group home because he was very aggressive and had a lot of emotional issues, and he was on 5 medications and they were not controlling his symptoms to the degree that they needed to in order for him to be at home. And at that point was he needs to be in a group home, and she didn't want to put him in a group home, so she sought to work with me, and we were able, and it took a few years. Definitely took some time. Fortunately, he was totally on board, because sometimes when we're working with kids, they're not on board with changing food at all. But fortunately he was, and really took to eating a gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free diet, and adding in all the vegetables and healthy fats, and was able to do the, we cleared the gut, improved the detoxification system, did all of the things that we normally do with, and he was able to come off of 4 of the 5 medications.
That is amazing.
And reduce it. And now he's living independently, has a part-time job. He also had motor tics, which significantly decreased, and he's doing great. And you would hardly know that he even has autism at this point. You would hardly know that. Occasionally you'll see the motor tic when he gets nervous or stressed, but for the most part, when he's happy and calm, he doesn't have any issues. So he's doing really, really well. And so there's definitely hope, and and he was able to move out of the home but live independently. So
yes, I love that.
Yeah. And so I think he's in his 20s now, but he's doing great. Yeah.
So this was the, I know you have a protocol. This was the diet and the getting the toxins out and getting.
Started with diet. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the thing about him, though, he was able to put gluten back into his diet. So, and so many times when you heal the gut and, really address digestion and these pathogens, these chronic pathogens, and detox pathways, and heal the gut lining, the increased gut permeability, sometimes you can reintroduce some of these foods. It depends.
Yes.
Depends on the person.
Absolutely.
Everybody's different. Everybody's different. Yeah. So there's definitely hope out there. I've had a few patients with autism, never a patient with Down syndrome, but I feel, and certainly lots of people with attention and anxiety and depression and OCD. But yeah, it's definitely, some definitely can improve symptoms. and, and with doing the entire, all of the things that can be done, all the layers, address all the layers,
Yes.
then,
And there are unfortunately so many layers, but yeah.
I know, then, but you can really give a person's life back. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you so much for sharing what you do with us. And I really, I am going to share this video with some people who are actually doing research on autism, just to, put it out there. Like, you got to listen to this,
Yes. Thank you.
at Brown University. And because I know several people who are doing research in autism, and they need to see this. They need to learn that this is something that should be part of their treatment protocols. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Achina. It was wonderful talking to you.
Yeah. Thanks again. Yeah. Bye. And if you love this episode, which I know you will, please hit the like button and subscribe.